For those who have already joined, thank you for joining us tonight for this conversation with Leslye Davis and Catrin Einhorn, who are the directors and producers of Father, Soldier, Son, a Netflix original documentary. You can find it streaming now if you have not already seen it. This conversation is part of our Outside the Box Office series and is also presented courtesy of Netflix. And we do not have a screening today because hopefully most of you have already seen it. But I want to thank Catrin and Leslye for joining us, and we'll jump right into questions. So thanks for being here, guys.
Thanks for having us.
I think, with documentaries especially, I really like sort of hearing more about the filmmakers' backgrounds leading into this, because I think it's such an important part of what shapes the perspective going into making it, just as it shapes my perspective watching it. So I'd love to hear kind of from both of you about your individual and collective journeys into both finding this topic, and one aspect of that would be interesting is if you have any experience with the military, whether you personally serving or having a family member or anything like that. So I'd love to kind of just hear that story from each of you of how we came to this topic.
Well, I don't really have any personal experience with the military, but was always fascinated by the military. I think actually since college and doing some reading and research in college. Fascinated, about the culture of the military and how it just felt like this world unto itself. So I really leapt at the opportunity to join this team in 2010 that was going to document one battalion's deployment to Afghanistan over the year in print and multimedia. And so, it was already 9 years into the Afghanistan war, and President Obama was sending in 30,000 additional troops. And we were trying to look for ways to really kind of get our readers to pay attention, because we were starting to feel like people were pretty fatigued with the war and not engaging as much. And it was kind of easy as an American, for many Americans who don't come from a military background, to kind of forget that the war was happening. I mean, that's perhaps still the case, right? 19 years later now. Anyway, so I was just really excited to be part of this team and to spend time on Army posts for the first time in my life. I remember going on to Fort Drum to meet a bunch of soldiers who were getting ready to deploy and really cast for characters, essentially. Yeah. And it was just it was just so exciting to enter that world. I do have some, my grandpa served in World War II in the Navy, and my mother was an immigrant from Wales, so her brother, my uncle, served in the British Navy. So there's some military in my family, but it certainly wasn't part of my upbringing.
My dad was drafted for Vietnam, but he wasn't in my life, so it wasn't really part of my upbringing. We're close now, so I've gotten to hear about his experience. My grandfather was in the Army. I think that the more interesting thing that I saw and experienced in relation to military growing up was just being encouraged really heavily to think about the military as an option for getting school paid for. I was from a small rural place, like Isaac in the film. And I saw that a lot. We had recruiters in the cafeteria a lot, and I thought about it myself just because it's a really great way to get your college paid for, and seemed like a good option. But my background is in photojournalism. I ended up going to school at Western Kentucky University for photo, and then I actually moved to New York to go to Tisch because I decided it'd be great. I wanted to make films, but then interned at the New York Times, and they offered me a job, and I ended up staying at the Times, and luckily Kat and I met. She and I met on one of my first assignments at the paper, and just really liked each other. And so we ended up, coming together again to work on this.
And so New York Times originally pitched this not as a feature, but as something shorter, and then it became a feature over time, correct?
Yeah, so it was this series that we did for a year, and there was a reporter, the military affairs reporter, Jim Dow, and one of our wonderful photographers, Damon Winter, actually embedded with this battalion, went to Afghanistan, traveled with them to Afghanistan. That's where you get that incredible shot that people may remember from inside the plane. the military transport plane. And took several trips over the course of that year. And I was producing it stateside, and being in touch with the soldiers while they were overseas. We were doing all kinds of updates. And then I went to Wisconsin to meet these two boys whose dad was deployed, and spent time with them while Brian was in Afghanistan, and then was there when they came home. And those two, you know, Isaac and Joey, were just, I mean, it just felt, you know, they just totally grabbed hold, I think, immediately. And the piece that came together, there was an article and a multimedia video that just felt really special. And so, and the family story, like, there were twists and turns almost from the beginning. Like, a couple months after I met Brian and the boys was when he was injured. And, you know, I got an email from his dad saying, like, there's been an incident. We don't know what happened. We think Brian stepped on a mine. You know, well, no, it turned out that wasn't the case, but we went and visited at Walter Reed. And then, you know, he vowed to keep his leg and to soldier on, right? And stay in the military. And then all that was upended. And so when he decided to get his leg amputated, it seemed like it was an excuse, sort of, that there was going to be enough plot to give us sort of the spine of a story. But really, like, the intent was to go back, and if the first story that had already published in 2010 was really like, how is this soldier's deployment affecting his sons? Now we could look at, well, how he's a veteran now, a wounded veteran, and, you know, how do the consequences of his service continue to ripple through his family years later? So that's sort of what we set out to look at. But we certainly didn't think that it was going to continue as long as it did.
And that was, so did you go to Netflix with that pitch of a thing of, like, or that Netflix came later? It was just, but you did have the concept of the feature film based on his injury. You were like,
it was Les, you should answer, but it was sort of a return. It was like, we didn't know at that point whether it was going to be a half hour or an hour. I don't know that we necessarily thought that it was going to be a feature film at that point. That wasn't really what we were supposed to be doing at the New York Times, right? We were supposed to be creating, but we certainly wanted to go back and tell a bigger story. But Les, you go ahead.
By the time we went to Netflix, we knew we wanted to make a feature film, and we had put together, I actually think this is really helpful for students to hear, like, we put together a reel. The reel was about 40 minutes of our best stuff, and we had a deck. And
that was in 2018, just to be clear. That wasn't in 2014.
Okay.
So 4 years went by. We filmed and filmed and filmed, and over the course of those 4 years, we knew that we wanted to make it into a feature film, and that's when we did all the things that Les is talking about.
And so when the film, because I did notice there's that jump where pretty shortly after he's injured, we jump 3 years forward.
Right.
And so I take it, you weren't filming throughout that entirety. It was kind of like you came back after some time to check in on them.
Right.
And then what was kind of the breakdown? Because it flows pretty seamlessly from there. It feels like we don't jump through time to that extent again very often. Mm-hmm. And yet you're covering a pretty significant span. What was can you tell me some of the logistics about shooting that? Of, like, how often were you coming in and filming, and, you know, things like that?
Yeah, so one of the great benefits of this story, and something that was a great benefit, I think, for me in school telling stories as well, was finding things that were close. So Kat and I, in our regular jobs, weirdly, even though there are so many great stories in New York, often are in, you know, working nationally overseas, but in this case, the family was 6 hours upstate, just a quick drive. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, like a kind of a thing that was a little hard for us, but also a thing that I think worked out really well, was that we were a really nimble, small team, and we were scrappy. And it was pretty cheap to make these trips. It kept people from being asking too many questions when we kept asking to go back. And a lot of the time, sometimes Kat and I would go together, and in the beginning, Kat was running sound because I was shooting on a 5D. And so she'd be doing audio, I'd be shooting. And then a lot of the time later on, I would go by myself, and the audio was integrated into my camera at that point. You really see the cameras evolve. So there's one chunk of time where we were really embedded with the family and spending a lot of time. And then you do see there's like another 2-year jump at the end. And that's not because we actually did have more trips in between. It was a matter of, restraint in the edit. Like there were things in those 2 years we could have included, but we really kind of wanted to get to this next chapter. So that's the other big jump in the film.
And how big was that crew you went there with? How many people were there?
It was either the two of us or me. Yeah.
So when you say a small crew, it was very small.
It was tiny.
At the very end, there was, we brought on, once Netflix came on board and we were doing exit interviews, then we were able to bring on an additional cinematographer.
One person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's really something special about it. And like often, we would, like if there were certain things that we knew were going to happen, I often, was there if there was like an event that we were going to, want to be there for and witness, and certainly interviews. But like sometimes there was something that maybe even something that was going to be harder to capture. It was just going to be better to have Leslye there by herself. And that like by being there by herself, she could blend into the background even more and really make it more like a fly on the wall. Just the more people you add to a situation, the harder and harder that gets. And that's true of any kind of reporting, I think. That's true of like print reporting actually too. Like just more people just creates, it changes the situation, right? And so trying to be as just quiet as possible for some of that filming was important.
Well, it really interferes with the ability to create a level of intimacy with the subject. And I think especially for something like this, that is extremely important. You are literally in this person's home and going through some really intensely vulnerable and personal moments with them. Can you say more about kind of what your relationship was like? You said you tried to sort of have a fly on the wall effect, but I'd love to hear more about kind of how your relationship with the family evolved and sort of how they responded to you as a filmmaker too.
That's a great question. I think that they felt really comfortable with us. They were constantly in contact. Catrin and Brian would be in touch a lot. Isaac and I would be in touch a lot. And they were really exceptionally open people. So I don't think it's necessarily anything, like if we had gone into this story, and I've done this with subjects before that are wonderful people and they really like me, and I think this happens to anyone who's embedding and documenting one's life, but they just, people don't have tolerance to be documented all the time. It's a really, depending on who you are, arduous effort. And in their case, it really wasn't. They felt very comfortable in front of the camera and in fact really enjoyed talking to us. Like they looked forward to those interviews and would talk about how it was like, they got so much off their chest. The reason we were able to be there in some of the really most intense moments, I think, was because we had invested a lot of time with the family. Has everyone, are we assuming our plot spoilers okay?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to have a thorough conversation here without giving away what I imagine you're about to talk about. So
yeah.
For those who haven't heard it, apologies. We're going to spoil some stuff now. If you want to mute yourself, I'll let you know when we're done. But
yeah, that's a good idea. But like when Joey died, that was, being able to be there for that was about that investment in like knowing what was happening in their lives and being there for big and small moments. But we did have these journalistic, ethical kind of set of boundaries that we also, it's hard because I think that like one of the things you want to do when you get close to someone is be, for me, like as a journalist and as a filmmaker, I want to reciprocate, right? Like if somebody tells you something really hard that they're going through, but they have a question for you, like you bare your soul. And I think that there are times when that is fine and it's actually kind of cathartic and it keeps you wanting to keep making things. But then there are times when it actually would really get in the way of the thing that you're trying to do. And in this case, I think we did have we were close with them and we knew them very well, but we didn't, offer a ton about ourselves or, and that was okay. They had way too much going on to be asking, and it created some natural boundaries, I think. What do you think, Kat?
Yeah, no, like as a journalist, you have to, right? So it's like you have to create those boundaries, and as much, this was certainly harder than any other story I've worked on to do that with, because not only, did we follow this family for 10 years, but also we were with that. I mean, especially certainly like when Joey died, it was just something like, to be with a family during the week after his death was, like nothing. And certainly like, as journalists, we parachute into very tragic situations sometimes. So like that's, I've had to call bereaved families after a mass shooting, or, you do have to do these terrible things, but that's totally different than, Brian calling us from the hospital and telling us that Joey was brain dead, and us like getting there as quickly as we could, thinking that he was still going to be alive, and then he was not, and then being with them in the aftermath. So it was just devastating.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing actually that I think it's a real testament to the relationship you guys must have built for him to even think to call you to notify you of that event happening, that he brought you into that. I mean, it shows, I think, both how, how much they trusted you, and also I think a sense of how much it seems that they wanted their story to kind of be told too. I
think it was almost like I think he was in shock, and so I don't know that it was like a very I don't think he understands it. I don't think we it was just what he did.
Since we're on this topic, while we're in the spoiler zone of the conversation, I guess, I found that part of the film so fascinating because it did not feel like you built up to it in any kind of obvious way. It's not something where you look back and rewatch the film from a narrative perspective. You're like, oh, I see where they planted this character. Like, if anything, I was anticipating this would result in Brian's tragic death. And suddenly it really hits you like a sledgehammer, and you really feel the grief of the family, and you feel the suddenness and the senselessness and tragicness of all of that event. And so I'd love for you, for both of you to talk about the decision to kind of craft the narrative in this way of, especially because you're kind of putting it together over time a little bit, sort of how you wanted to approach this tragic event from a storyteller perspective, and the decision of how you told it the way you did.
Well, we talked about that a lot because, when we got to this point in the production, this insanely tragic thing that we were part of, we weren't making a film about a family losing a child. We had been working really hard to build a plot around a certain set of themes and ideas. And so easily the film, we had plenty of footage. The film could have been about the death of Joey, and that could have been its whole own film. And there were also some moments when we were going back in the editing that were just like shockingly telling. There's a moment in an interview where Brian's talking about how he's having nightmares, and obviously that could relate to PTSD, but he literally has a nightmare that his kid is on the road and dies. And then these things that he would talk about, but we were really trying to focus on this specific thing. We weren't trying to foreshadow. And if you go back and watch, actually, there are like a couple of moments that we rewatching the footage were really startled by. Like, Joey is on the road riding his bike with Brian when Brian runs for the first time, and he was his buddy. He was just there for that stuff. But
he tells him to stay off the road.
He tells him to stay off the road.
If you go back and listen,
wow.
that is planted in there. He says, "Stay off the road."
Yeah.
But we wanted to be very subtle with it. I mean, you're right that we weren't foreshadowing it in a big way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, and we also wouldn't have. I mean, the family, it feels the way it felt. That's how I think it felt for them. It's how it felt for us. It was the first thing we shot after their wedding. They'd had this huge moment of contentment, and Brian comes to terms with all these things he's been unsettled with in his life, and he's ready to move forward and be happy. And that really was how that shoot felt, and that how life unfolded for them. And so, yeah.
I mean, it is a really powerful moment, and I mean the children are such an important part of sort of how this story is kind of put together, and there's this generational component that's really woven into it. Leslye, you actually said something at the beginning that struck me, where you talked about how present the military was in your upbringing, and the sense of kind of this, how they become an outlet for desperation almost, a place that people can turn to as and you hear that with, not sure, Isaac, right? That's the older son's name. You know, when they're in the car at one point and he's saying, you know, I want to go to college, I want to do this. And the father's like, you won't. Like, I can tell you that's not going to happen. And there's this sense of how people almost get trapped into this. And how there's this sort of, what I wrote down was sort of an indoctrination of sorts, almost from an early age, of how important this is and how meaningful this is to identity. And there are parts where Brian later on is talking about how after he's injured, he like feels guilt for not being able to serve more, and how like that's one of the main things he deals with. And I guess the closest I came to a question with this would just be wanting to kind of hear some of your reflections on that, of like, you know, I felt like I read it from the perspective of someone who has a very fixed view of war, and sort of what the role of war should be, and sort of our military industrial complex and all that stuff. And I'd kind of love to hear the ways that your own thoughts ended up shaping this story, but maybe changed in being in such an intimate environment, or if you saw a different side of it in being so up close and personal that created sort of new senses around, you know, what the role of this sort of cycle is for that community and for that family, really.
You want me to start, Les, or you want
Yeah,
to go?
sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think we really wanted to provide a window into like a certain kind of culture in America. And I think what we really started was really looking at, you know, how does war affect how does their dad's deployment affect these boys? How does the aftermath of their dad's deployment affect these boys and his injuries in combat? But then because we were able to invest so much time in it, it really does open up into these more universal ideas of like the handing down of values, of cultural beliefs, of, you know, you could call them ideologies. Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting to hear you use the word indoctrination. Like, I think that we probably all indoctrinate our children in different ways, right? You were probably indoctrinated by your liberal parents, maybe, I don't know.
Absolutely.
Right? So you have a more pacifist view on the world, and then, you know, and then Brian shared his values with his sons. I mean, I don't know if people here have watched A Fathers and Sons, but like that's an interesting film also to watch in terms of how these ideas are passed down generationally. I mean, our culture, we cannot, I mean, can people escape their cultures? They can, but you know, it's really something that that reproduces itself, and I think that that's something that we really wanted to open this window into.
But I think also something that you're kind of pointing toward in terms of, I think you might have said the word like feeling trapped, or like there are socioeconomic factors at play in this film, and there are a lot of, in the decision to enlist, very often socioeconomic factors at play. There are questions of citizenship at play in some cases. That ceremony where Isaac was graduating from basic training, the beginning of the ceremony was actually, some people were being made citizens because they had enlisted in the army and completed basic training. You know, there are these circumstances that make this path, like what Brian says in the film, it's secure. He knows his kid will get raises. He knows his kid will have security. I think if Brian could have stepped back and imagined the emotional repercussions it would have for Isaac, the way that they played out, he's a loving dad. He would have taken that more into account, but all he could see was his experience, which had been actually, despite being shot, despite having this huge loss of identity and, you know, feeling lost after service, he would describe it as extremely positive. And so the idea that Isaac had these handful of options available to him, college was certainly available to him. And in fact, he could have had it fully paid for because his dad had a Purple Heart. But it seemed out of reach because to his family, it had seemed out of reach. And his dad talks about he was working at Walmart and then suddenly he was a soldier. This is like it's a career where what Kat was saying, like, if our those who have like liberal parents that indoctrinate them to go to college, like there's not a kind of certainty that you might get injured, like there's not a kind of certainty that you might go to a war that you don't understand. It's just the factors around it are quite different, but I think it's just important to think about what Isaac's alternatives in his mind were. Like now, we published a piece in the New York Times, the epilogue, to kind of update where the family's at now. Isaac's working at a plastics manufacturing factory, and he was living in his dad's basement when he went. He got out. He's left the military, yeah. So he actually got chaptered out because he was having so much trouble staying in. And he talks still about re-enlisting in a combat role because, again, that sense of meaning and purpose and duty that's wrapped up in this career. It's different than the other. Yeah.
That's the combination of sort of the economic realities coupled with these cultural values, these really strong values of, patriotic duty, those kinds of ideas that really, create a very strong force.
You had said because he's having so much trouble, he talks about dealing with depression right at the end of the film. And it actually was kind of surprising for me to see that in some way because, for a whole host of reasons, but it's not an environment where that kind of discussion of emotion seems really encouraged in that way. You can juxtapose that to the scene of Joey crying while wrestling at one point and his dad talking about how much he hates it. To see him crying that way in a you need to man up and be aggressive kind of thing. Was the depression a factor in sort of his dropping out of the military and things like that, or were there other problems?
Yeah.
It seems so. Yeah. He couldn't. He was late for work. He couldn't get out of bed. Like he didn't show up for work. It was that kind of thing.
I think I wrote down actually sort of the last line of it where he's talking about his depression. It's like one of the last lines of the movie, I think, where he says, I know my dad is proud of me, but I feel like I'm letting him down sometimes because I'm not doing what he did. I'm just a bottom of the line soldier, but I want to go to war someday. That is what I was grown up to do. And I think somewhere within there, he also talks about how he feels like he can't talk to his dad about it because his dad handles it so well. And it's this amazing juxtaposition because his dad is falling apart. His Brian is constantly seems like he's on edge and clearly is dealing with PTSD on some level, multiple levels of PTSD. And I think one of what I read in the film that I found really interesting was, on one hand, there's this commentary of, it's not so much a commentary, it's an investigation of sort of how military service is built in within that culture. But I think the other side of it is this really interesting reflection on sort of what the concept of masculinity is in that culture. He makes multiple references to that, of feeling like his manhood's been taken away because he can't walk the same way or can't do things for himself. So I think I'd really love to hear how that sort of entered your thought process in craft, because it felt so present to me, of the denial of the emotional side, the denial of vulnerability. And even when saying goodbye to his kid, he says to Isaac, like, you can't cry once you leave this driveway because you're a man at that point. So I'd love to hear sort of your reflection on that and your own observations of that.
Well, interesting. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
It's so interesting that Brian is so, he has these mantras, but I mean, if he were listening, I would say this: he is so emotional and he can be so vulnerable, like much more so than some people that might tell you it's okay to cry. I've never seen you cry. Brian's actually, as you say, when he's falling apart, he's also feeling those feelings, and he will tell you he's feeling those feelings. And when he has these ideas about, my service made my kids stronger, he will back it up with, I don't see any problems with the trauma of my leaving them, or at least maybe I refuse to see them, but I don't see them, like he has these little acknowledgments. It's more like, it was interesting seeing who Brian thought he should be and then how that gets passed on to his kids. And like the most interesting thing about the film and about the privilege of getting to spend so much time with this family is seeing how when they were little and their dad was just, you know, he was in this vulnerable position where he's leaving them and he might die and he's the most important person in their life, their only parent. How that image of their dad is so burned into their minds, you know, like if you asked Isaac in 2016, like to describe his dad, he'd be like, my dad's super strong, super tough. You know, Brian's like, I gained 40 pounds. He would, you know, make fun of himself. He'd call himself the short, fat, one-legged guys. How he refers to himself is not how we refer to him. But like Isaac saw him, he had burned into his mind this moment in time of his dad, this like most perfect moment of his hero. And see how as a child, that trauma of his dad being away and the fear that something would happen to him impacted his view of his dad, which impacted his view of who he was supposed to be, and how unshakable those experiences can be in our lives. They just remain as pillars that create who we are and are, you know, kind of hard to take apart. But in terms of Isaac's lines at the end, Isaac is very sensitive, you know, he's very emotive and caring, and he has complex thoughts and feelings. And so there was this interesting period of time between when Kat met the boys when they were little, and they're so sensitive and they're so communicative. And then when we went back when they were teenagers and preteen, it was like trying to, you know, trying to pull any kind of a thoughtful, nuanced, emotional quote out of them. They were just like, shut down. Yeah. And then Isaac at the end, well, you should talk about the exit interview, Kat. So nice.
Well, just how he really, it was clear that he had some things he wanted to talk about and really, you know, wanted to tell us that he'd been feeling depressed. And that was like a realization that he'd come to after being so emotionally, as Les was saying, like, I mean, we would just try every which way to get him to access his emotions in those interviews. And it was really hard for a while. It was really hard for a while. The other thing about masculinity, I guess I just want to bring it back to the same way that these sort of values of like patriotism and military service are passed down from one generation to the next, these ideas of masculinity, it's just another part of culture, right? And I think a lot of what this film is about and underneath everything is culture and the handing down of culture and of, you know, these cultural ideas and small c culture, not big C culture, obviously. And so, yeah, it's really a part of that. And, you know, here we are in our society right now where we're having such a robust conversation about masculinity and gender at large. But, you know, in many places in the United States, that's not, you don't see that happening in the same ways. And, you know, certainly Isaac has internalized, you know, these ideas that are very traditional about what a man is supposed to be.
I think it's really interesting to hear about that part of it too, because it's, you know, what I see in this film, which is really interesting, is it represents a very specific, and what I find to be a really effective form of journalistic storytelling, which is focusing on the complexities of this individual. And as the opposite end of it is like focusing on a systemic problem and like having it be more like, this is what we're saying is the issue and we're trying to address it. And you guys seem to, the two of you really seem to err more towards the like, I mean, you both have even said here, these are really complex people with complex thoughts going through a lot of different things. And it seems like, I guess I'm leading towards asking about like how, if you felt like there were points where, I don't know, maybe you wanted to comment more on something, but wanted to restrain that and instead focus on the individual stories or, you know, the ways that you maybe set aside certain views of things. And I don't know, it's tough because I don't have a straightforward question about it, but I do think it's a complicated process and a complicated form of storytelling. And I think I just would like to hear you sort of unpack that process a little bit more.
I would say the question, which Kat, you should answer this, but the question that people have around what you're asking, which is like, in a verité film, there are certain things you can't present because you can't interrogate them. And the question people have asked us is, why aren't politics in the film?
Yeah.
Is that what you're kind of getting at? I mean, is that a...
Yeah, actually, I think that's a really constructive way of framing that question,
Mhm.
because it is something I thought of like, you know, you open with a presidential speech, and then there's another moment where Brian's watching TV and the president's about to give an address on the war. And so it is both present and completely absent from the film, in that we don't get his reaction to actual political decision making. We don't get people's reactions to like the Afghanistan war in any, you know, really tangible sense. So I do actually think that's a really generative way of framing it, is sort of how you remove politics from the story, the decision to remove politics and political reflection from the story, and sort of how your own, you know, choices.
I wouldn't say that politics is removed, because I mean the decision to go to war is a political decision, and these are people who are experiencing the aftermath of political decisions. So it's very political in that way.
Yes.
They have two major comments on the war sort of later on in the film, right? Isaac, we hear, doesn't really know anything about the war. He doesn't know how we got into the war. He doesn't know why we're fighting the war. All he knows is that he loves his country. And so that, I think, is such a revealing statement. Having spent a lot of time with young soldiers, this is not uncommon, right? This is what's motivating them. These are not informed decisions because they believe in this policy that the United States has embarked upon. This is like their patriotic duty again. And then we hear Brian at the end saying, you know, I saw on the news that the town square I used to patrol, some bad guys took it over, some Taliban essentially took it over. And, you know, I asked myself, was it really worth it? You know, and this is Brian, who is quite, you know, really like a soldier, questioning whether the Afghanistan war was worth it. You know, and earlier on in the film, we hear him say that he was glad he went to war because he was part of something bigger than himself. So I think that a lot of this is really about the search for meaning, and how certainly military service, this call to duty, is really like a search for meaning for many people and purpose in their lives. And that's a very strong pull. And again, getting back to what Les was talking about earlier, like when you come from a community and a background in which like your opportunities are, you know, working at the fast food restaurant or working at Walmart, or, you know, or going and serving your country and doing something big and historic, maybe that's going to feel quite attractive to you. And I think we see that a lot. Yeah. And then, you know, in terms of, so of course, you know, there was this seismic shift in the United States over the 10 years that we filmed. President Trump was elected in 2016. I don't think it would come as any surprise to anyone watching the film that they are red state Americans, this family. We did experiment with trying to put some of that in the film. We interviewed Brian about his political thoughts, but it, you know, in a verité observational film, it ends up coming across actually as propaganda. Like if he's just talking about his political beliefs and there's no way that we can interrogate that, it really doesn't work. And there wasn't really opportunity for verité around his political decisions. Like he wasn't doing things. So, you know, so we really thought long and hard about whether to include political stuff, you know, sort of in 2016 particularly, because obviously that was a huge thing that happened in our country, but it just didn't work.
I think we answered some stuff. So someone emailed me earlier today who is a soldier and had some questions, some really thoughtful questions. I am going to open up to audience questions here. I wanted to start with him if he's with us. I think we addressed some of that already, but I'm going to invite him to quickly join the panel to ask the other questions that we didn't address. And of course, you know, for everyone else who's still watching, you know, you can type your question into that little Q&A box, and we'll kind of get to you each one by one and welcome you in. And we invite you to turn on your video if you want, or you can talk just through audio, whatever's comfortable for you. So this is Makoto Yoshida, who I'm inviting up, who will speak first. It's for a panelist. There we go. Okay, Miko, you're on. If you want to turn on your video, you're welcome to, or you can just do audio.
Except you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted still, though.
Right.
Perfect.
You hear me know?
Hi.
Okay. Thank you for the panel and thank you for the film. I kind of wanted to pose a question that I've been thinking about. I've done 3 deployments to Afghanistan myself as a Marine, and I think you know, there's a lot of things that we need to think about. But one thing that I was curious about for you guys is, you know, whether you want to call it art or journalism or just straight filmmaking, how do you balance the need to be critical in examining the military and the culture while being sensitive to kind of the political sanctity of the institution? We have a lot of elevation of veterans and, you know, people who've quote sacrificed for the country. I feel that often the critique of the military is distanced and lacking because we feel we must be cautious of offending people. And patriotism as a concept, it's really obviously deeply rooted in the military culture, not just the soldiers themselves, but, you know, their friends and family. And so to critique that is often considered un-American. But I think critique is extremely necessary, which is very evident in your film, right? Because this is a cycle that is generational, this is a cycle that is systemic, and often, in my mind, predatory in the sense that we are recruiting, you know, young men and women as not really an option. Like, this is the only way to get out, you know, and I was one of those people to some degree. So, you know, getting to my question, do you feel as artists / journalists that you have that critical freedom to examine this topic with impunity? Because my sense from the film was that you kind of were distanced, right? And I understand the style and the way that you did it. But if you don't feel like you have that, you know, do you feel the need to push through that, or do you feel the need to kind of skirt or toe the line between balancing and telling the story without turning people off of it? Because I think, you know, right now anything critical often turns people off. And, you know, I guess my question is like, well, that's my question. So happy to hear your thoughts on that.
You want to start, Les, or you want me to?
Yeah, no, it's so interesting to hear from you. I mean, we're so curious to hear what people who have served thought of the film and how they felt about it, reacted to it. So yeah, Kat and I were really cautious about being respectful of the service that people make in the military. And we didn't want to bring our like a political agenda or a point of view to the film, because we wanted people to be able to watch it and make up their own minds about what they saw, to see what this family went through, to see what Brian went through, what the kids went through. I think it's hard not, I mean, I think the criticism of the experience of being in the military and what it requires of you and what it asks for you, not in a less formal way than another job would. You know, if I were deploying overseas, I would have, to document soldiers overseas, there would be a sort of different set of expectations about what I could expect in terms of support and what would come afterward. Whereas soldiers, it's really like your duty, like you're supposed to do this thing and you're supposed to do it freely and give of yourself and for your country. So to see what they went through and not feel like there is some sort of critique of that experience, I would think would be hard. But the war, I think in particular, which is obviously in the background of this film, that like there were reasons for that. One reason is that Americans don't know the war is happening. They don't even know people are deploying to Afghanistan actively. They don't know, like Isaac, what caused the war, or if it's ending, or what's happening now. But the other thing that we wanted to show is that these soldiers come out so disillusioned after service. Like they don't understand in some cases why they deployed, or they find so much purpose in it in such an intense way, and they come out injured, and then they don't know who they are, or they don't know what they have to offer in the civilian world or what job they're supposed to do. I think we just wanted to show that and not tell people what to think about it. And it's interesting to know what people coming from different backgrounds will come away with, or what they'll think in the end. Some people will come away and say like, wow, that was an intense critique of the military. And other people come away and say, wow, what a portrait of patriotism and prideful telling of an American story. And that has been really fascinating to me. So we wanted to give people that opportunity to experience something that they hadn't experienced, and also to come from a place that was very different than another person, and in some cases leave with completely opposite things.
And just to add to that, remember, we're journalists at the New York Times, and this is a New York Times production. So this is not our opportunity to bare our souls as artists in a way that if we were making an independent film, we would be operating in a different way, perhaps. But we are New York Times journalists, and this is a piece of New York Times journalism. And so it's really like a window more. It's a show don't tell. And I mean, it's exciting to me that you, with your experience and your life story, like if you're saying that the military, if the Marines need a critique, then it seems like you're the one to do it.
Okay, I mean, that's fair. I think, just if you don't mind me following up, this is one story, but there's millions of veterans, and I feel that, at least in my experience, is a very run-of-the-mill. Obviously there's a lot of unique experiences in his personal life, but just generally people coming back feeling worthless, feeling emasculated, and handling the trauma in a way that in my mind is toxic from a masculinity perspective. We are trained to not feel, and we project that upon each other and our families. But this is not a rare story, right? And I think the more that we do this, it's good as far as exposure goes for people to understand what people go through. But at the same time, I know as journalists you're trying to be objective and inform the public, but where do you draw the line between that and really looking into why are we doing this to ourselves? Why are we perpetuating this cycle? And I know that may sound, to me, it's not political, right? To me, it is a very common sense cause and effect examination of where we are as a country, who we are as people, and why we keep doing this to ourselves. And for me, again, I didn't get that out of the film. I just saw an experience. I really empathized with it. I felt like it was essentially a tragedy in many different ways. But I'd be curious. So my follow-up question, is to understand the reception of this film as, is this being received as maybe it's a critique, or maybe it's a tragedy, or maybe it is literally just a depiction of one American family who had to deal with the aftermath of war. And my hope is that it will be received as a critique, or at least an urge to examine this and to reach out to people. But is that how it's been received, or how?
As Les said, it's really been received in some different ways. One woman said, this is such an anti-war film, and then other people have said, this is as Les said, this is an inspiring portrait of, duty. I think that one of the reactions that has been most meaningful to me is that we were doing some interviews with some media, and there was someone who was military. She was military spouse, and she's writing for a military publication, and she got on the phone with us, and the first thing she said was, this is different than I thought it was going to be. And so we said, why? Well, before we even started talking to her,
she was unhappy. She was a little biting.
Her tone sounded a little hostile. There's an edge. And so we said, well, what did you think it was before we start? Like, what did you think it was going to be? And she said, well, I thought it was going to be inspiring, and instead it was just like really real. And I was like,
yeah.
Perfect.
And one of the reviews that we got within one review, so there will be two different reviews that take things very differently depending on the kind of tone of that publication. But one of the reviews, the last line said, depending on who you are when you watch this, you'll either find it disturbing or patriotic. And I was like, wow, yeah. And I think the thing is, like, the kind of film that you're talking about, as journalists at the Times, Kat and I, the Times is largely viewed, even though as journalists we strive to be independent and to approach stories without bringing our perspective. The Times is largely liberal. Our readership is liberal. Like we want to reach people and bring them facts and bring them reporting and bring them like hard fought journalistic stories that, you know, we sometimes cannot get through the barrier of being the enemy of the people and having this like sort of scarlet letter on of like, you know, liberal publication. And we didn't want to like tell people what to think. We wanted to show them the story and let them think for themselves. And I think that like I love, you know, an artistic film that really brings a strong point of view and a strong perspective. But in this case, I think that the power of sharing the family story without putting our own message into it is that it provokes people to ask themselves these questions instead of us telling them what the answers are. And, you know, you see Isaac when he's going into the military and he's like, I don't know what the war is. I don't know when it started. All I know is I love America, I love my country, and I want to fight. And that, I mean, you know, like, there's a lot wrapped up in that. And depending on who you are, you know, some people say, hell yeah. And some people say, oh my God. And I think the fact that we're able to get both of those kinds of people to watch it and think about it that's actually truly what we set out to do. And when the film actually went out into the world, I think Kat and I were kind of on pins and needles. I didn't know if anyone would want to watch it, first of all, because it's, you know, it is a commitment, I think, to be in this, like you said, it's about this one story, this one family. And their experience is pretty, like, in many ways, very average, you know, like, they're not some, like, outstandingly different family. And we also like that about them. But it's also, you know, it asks you to think a lot. The film, it really asks you to think. There's no point in the film where we're like, here it is, like, that's the story. And I don't know, I think that good cinema can do both.
Yeah.
So.
No, and thank you. And I don't want to take up more of your time. I just wanted to say
we love hearing
one
from
thing.
you. No, it's so interesting.
You know, just the scene of the graduation of the boot camp to me. I mean, you have literally, you know, smoke billowing like a halftime show, and even the lyrics of the music to me was disturbing, right? Even as somebody who was in the military. But depending on, like you said, who you are, you might see that as a, you know, amazingly patriotic moment where these young men are now turned into soldiers and are ready to go to war, versus this Hollywoodized production of, you know, the most basic thing that every soldier has to do. And I think that scene really did it for me, because 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I was in, you know, I would have looked at that completely differently than I do now, you know, looking back. And so I just want to say props for including that. It was very disturbing for me, but I think it was a very searing moment of the film where that's the lens, depending on the lens that you have at that very moment, you would make that decision. So anyway, thank you for your time.
It's so nice to hear from you. Can't wait to see what movies you make.
Exactly.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Miko. Appreciate it. So I'm going to bring in some more in a sec. But the quick question that came up talking to Miko is, I don't think we've covered yet, how has Brian and their family responded to the film? And I'd really love to know if there's anything that surprised him or anything about his reaction that surprised you, anything along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we flew and showed it to them in person. Brian, Maria, Jordan, you know, their family, and then Isaac was at Fort Bragg, so we did 2 trips. And at the end, Brian, you know, well, they laughed and cried a lot, right? Especially with Joey. So that was seeing that footage of Joey was obviously very emotional for them. But at the very end, you know, when Maria sort of really tells us honestly how Brian's doing, I think we were really nervous about how Brian was gonna take that. That was a hard thing to maybe hear your partner saying about you, really real. But he said, he looked at us and he said, you know what? It's true. I am really struggling with that. This is real. I like it. And he ended up watching, and Isaac also, you know, Isaac sort of had a similar reaction, laughed and cried, and, you know, sort of like they, you know, they liked it. And they've now watched it many times. And we were just on a Q&A with Brian earlier. And you know, he keeps saying, I'm still kind of figuring out the message of it. And, you know, I don't know that there's one message in this film, you know, per what we were just discussing, but there are hopefully many. And yeah, he seems, I think he certainly is. I think we're really grateful to him for being so vulnerable and really putting himself out there in the way that he did, and letting us tell a story about America, because he did so.
Well, I think that's a sign that he had made a good film, that even the subject feels that it's complex and shows a lot of things, and is still happy with it. We have a question from Lisa Lehman. I believe she says here she would rather stay off camera. So I will just read this for her. She asked if you can talk about how you chose to compress or jump time during the edit. She says, I'm trying to compress 6 years of filming. So I think she'd appreciate the advice from you. And Lisa, if you'd want to talk, oh, I see you down here. Please ask the question. Okay. So there you go. Yeah. So she'd love to hear on just sort of that process of compressing all that footage.
I think part of the benefit, I hope Lisa's been doing this over her 6 years, is that Kat and I really were storyboarding and doing a lot of work throughout that time. Like, we were pulling selects, reading interviews, thinking, and we actually did go into the edit with a pretty solid storyboard on paper. Now that got chiseled down, and we had an amazing editor named Amy Foote and an amazing consulting editor, Jeff Richmond, who they were, I mean, that's the best advice, get yourself a rock star, but we were very lucky we got to work with them, and that you know, Amy was even available, because she has such a intuitive feel for how emotions can drive a fact, you know, how you can say something without saying something. But I think we did have a 3-hour cut at one point, and then we, you know, chiseled it down. I think we also had the benefit of Kat and I being able to be in the edit space, and, you know, we would try things. Kat loves to talk things through and think about it very thoroughly. I do too, but I'm also kind of give me that footage, let's try. I want to see what this scene looks like. And so we did actually cut a lot of scenes that we ended up tossing. But those key moments that really drove the story had risen to the fore kind of earlier, the fight, the wrestling scene, the snowblower, the fight with Isaac and Brian. There were a couple of key things we knew for sure we were going to use. And the early stuff that really establishes who the kids are and where they start and how they end up. I think that was really helpful.
And that's thematic. So I think that the answer to your question is that it's thematic. So you obviously have to decide what your themes are, what are you doing? And then that's going to drive what you're leaving out and what you're keeping in. In addition, there is this sort of one of the golden rules of journalism: when you're kind of overwhelmed with a story, or you're just swimming in too much information, then you think, well, you know, talk it through with someone. And actually, when you talk it through with someone, and kind of the most interesting things rise to the top usually. And what you're in the, you know, what is it that you tell your friend or your partner, or, you know, your mom or whoever about the shoot that you just went on? That's probably going to be one of the most interesting moments. Now, if it's thematically irrelevant, you might have to discard it anyway. Or you might be able to maybe find a way to get it in. You'll have to see. It depends how really good
Especially if it's funny. You got to keep your laugh lines all the time, every time.
But we did have to lose one of our favorite laugh lines, because it emotionally destroyed it. It was just the wrong emotion for a certain scene. It still bothers me that we couldn't put it in, but it was really it was a good cause. It was for the best. But I think that those two things are two ways to do it. And look, we were lucky at some point to have Netflix come on and to be able to hire Amy and Jeff. And I think in the absence of that, and, you know, we don't usually, you know, Les and I have done, you know, all our projects up until now. And a much scrappier way. And that's, and it's just like, we are both a big believer in like getting feedback from people. So show it to people, show it to people, and 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 like find people who you can collaborate with and exchange ideas with, and, you know, trade feedback on pieces, and be open to feedback. Not that you're going to accept it all, right? You might actually disagree with someone. Maybe they're wrong for your film, but like be open to all that feedback, and don't, you know, and take it openly and to heart, because like someone's trying to help you make your thing better. And then you decide whether it actually makes your thing better or not.
But also like believe in yourself. And if someone's idea of being a constructive collaborator and a friend to you is telling you that your idea is shit and that it's not going to be good, like don't ask them twice, because if you know it's good, you know it's good. People told us to stop working on this constantly. We climbed a fucking mountain to make this movie, and I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on the recording, but we climbed a mountain to make this movie, and like we had a lot of help and support in many ways, but we also had a lot of people who, I don't know, you know, filmmakers can be the most, from my experience with this and with my friends, like the most collaborative, caring, like family-oriented group of people you can bring together in a room, but they can also be like, you know, very set in their opinions about what is good. And if what is good for them is not good for you, that's okay. Like that's not like anybody. I just think like know what you're capable of. Know that you know you have a vision, and if they can't see it yet, it's because they just don't visualize the same way you do. You know, and I think that the first so I was gonna say earlier, we showed this 40-minute cut, like a reel of selects to our partners at Netflix. They're like brilliant, wonderful. We actually ended up working with some really just incredible people over there, but the 40-minute cut we showed them, they thought, they were like, we should take it to Frontline, and rightfully so, because we weren't able to like show them what we were making. But Kat and I were like, no, you don't understand. Like this film is going to be like this, and we could say it, but we hadn't shown them yet. But we knew what we were making was not going to be. I love Frontline. I think that's a fantastic program, but we knew this wasn't that. We knew exactly what it was, and so to have someone like multiple people tell us like, just make a Frontline episode. It was like, no, you know what you're making. And so I think when you have 6 years of footage, you have to be pretty, it was great to have a partner in this, because I think to have so many people tell me to either stop or make it into something I knew it wasn't, without a partner who I could go back into the, you know, the cafeteria and like grab a seltzer and be like, damn, we're still going to make the thing we know we want to make. It was really helpful to have that. But yeah.
I'm curious what some of those concerns were of people, because it seems to me like a really pitchable idea. So I'd love to hear more of like why people were skeptical, and you know, just why they would react that way. It strikes me as odd.
Well, because it was like, why are you still doing this?
Oh,
go ahead, Kat.
That's a reasonable question.
Yeah.
Look, you know, I think that part of it, is that we work at the New York Times, and this is something that we were doing kind of on the side as we did other, you know, we were publishing stories and videos and articles, and this is what we kept kind of returning to on the side. And I don't think not necessarily everyone understood what we were doing. We understood what we were doing, and we just kept doing it. And we were really lucky that over time, you know, recently the New York Times has started this whole new department of film and TV series off platform. And so once we were able to kind of move over to that section, then it made sense. Like then we had sort of an infrastructure to go to Netflix with. Previously, it was like, you know, this is something that it was supposed to run on the New York Times website, which we didn't ever think made sense. You know, we knew that it should be longer, and we knew that like our audience doesn't watch films on the New York Times. So I think that was part of what Les is talking about. It was just like we were an odd duck for a while until actually like the company kind of met us where we were, and then doors opened, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, let's get some other audience questions here. We have a few. I think I want to bring in Jing Tong Wu has a couple of questions. So I'll bring them in real quick. Participants. And there we go. And Jingtong, you're invited to turn on your video if you'd like. Otherwise, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question orally.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the amazing documentary. My question is, what's the experience of documenting something for 10 years, because so many unexpected things happen, so you couldn't really plan out the plots and everything at the start?
Yeah, it was, I don't think, I mean, it was certainly like, if we were in 2010 knowing that we were going to make a feature film about this family, we would have made very different decisions. But I think that it's a testament to, you know, if you just do your best and you're documenting something as best you can and as thoroughly as you can and as deeply and emotionally as you can, you know, it may stand up, because that's how it turned out, right? And even once we kind of restarted in 2014 and we were thinking of doing something longer, our filming and our process really evolved, you know, from 2014 to 2019, as we realized sort of, I don't know how to best tell the story. I mean, I guess the answer to your question is like, just go with it. Like, go with it, and like, you always try to plan. It's great to plan. As a filmmaker, as a journalist, you always want to try and plan, but the best laid plans get thrown up in the air, and you just are making the best decisions you can in the moment. Les, did you want to add?
Yeah, and just to add on to the fact that, like, the film, if you watch it, really has a couple of moments. It could have been endings, and I think that, for example, when Jackson was born, the family probably was like, okay, you're done now, right? Like, that's a great ending. A baby got born. And we, you know, even though we pushed so hard and we followed them through so many things, that wasn't our ending. You know, we did not want to make this be a film that was like, and they persevered and everything was great because a baby was born. And so just knowing your message, like what Cal was saying earlier about themes, what are you ultimately trying to say? And that question drove us to keep going for several more years after Jackson was born.
All right, thanks, Jingtong.
Thank you.
Thank you for answering my question.
Oh, thank you for your question.
Yeah.
So there are two more questions. I want to warn the audience, this is getting into spoiler territory again, so feel free to mute yourself if you don't want to know what happens to the film. I'm going to invite Lauren White to speak. She wants to stay off camera. Lauren, if you can't do audio, just do nothing and I'll read it for you if you want. But I'm going to try to invite you in right now.
I hope Lauren's at a rave or something, so she can't do audio because it's
No, you don't hope she's in a rave during a
house
pandemic.
music. Oh, that's right. There's a pandemic. Never mind. Don't be at a rave.
Hey guys,
Hi.
My husband's driving. I'm actually, speaking of, I'm just driving through Camp Pendleton and looking actually at some military men. So my question, this is spoiler alert for everyone that's listening. First of all, you guys, what a fantastic, beautiful, heart-wrenching, wow. It was just a beautiful film. I have a lot of family in the military. It actually inspired me where I want to kind of create something to, when you get out of the military, you know, almost like a, you know, there's like a post kind of program you go to, and anyhow, it's just fantastic. So, spoiler alert, when in the film where the youngest son, unfortunately, dies, like, obviously you don't plan for those things. Like, how did you guys, I mean, this is a documentary, if something like that happened, like, how did you guys deal with that challenge? What did the family reaction, like, I mean, there's so many questions. I'm just going to drop the mic there, and if you guys could explain how you guys persevered, because you guys, that could have been an ending, and it that you guys kept going?
Yeah. That was just like a horribly, terribly difficult thing to go through, having known Joey for so long, and he was just fantastic, you know. It was really difficult to experience, difficult to keep. We had to keep doing our jobs, and we had to like not weep the entire time, and you know, try to do the best we could to keep it as respectful as possible, to stay out of the way. It was really helpful that we knew everyone in the community and that we had been documenting. Like, we knew his wrestling teammates, we knew his classmates, we knew his coaches, we knew the neighbors, we knew everybody that was there. They had already seen us, and in some cases I think it would almost be weird if we weren't there, because we had been around documenting everything that happened in their lives. I think this is another case where having a partner was extremely helpful, and having someone to just emotional tag team with, like, all right, I'm just going to be a shell of a person for a minute and make sure the camera's in focus. Can you be the person in the front right now, was really essential. And yeah, do you have anything to add, Kat?
No, it was just, I mean, it was just so hard to know. It was not what we wanted to be doing, right? This was not the story that we wanted to tell. And yet this was happening in their lives. We were deeply invested in this family and their story. And it was like, what do? You have to film it. You have to film it, right? And so we basically said that to them. We said, look, like this isn't what we want to be doing, but this is what's happening. We can't stop. I mean, it was clear that we could not end there. We could not end there. And so, Brian said, sure. He said, just keep it classy. Just keep it classy. And we did all, we basically shot from far back, and they're not laved up. Like, in that week after Joey died, we never put lavaliers on them. Like, we were just kind of like getting what we could. And if it wasn't great, like, if the audio wasn't as great as it should be, or if even, we weren't up there getting the best shots, that was okay. Like, it was just like, we're just going to document what we can in a respectful way, which was still hard. It was still hard to be shooting, but but we knew it was what we had to do. And we knew that the family was okay with it.
Well, you guys, it was just, you guys did a beautiful job, and you honored him, and that's what, I'm just getting the chills. I had another question, or the follow-up, and last question is will there be a follow-up to this? Because I'm so excited. Is it Isaiah?
Isaac?
Yeah, Isaac. Is there a follow-up? I mean, this family, I feel like they're my family, like I want to know, like, what happens to him. And it also kind of speaks to the gentleman earlier that was in the military who spoke. If you're still listening, great questions and great critique. Is, you see this kid from when he was a young age, then joining, and you see so much in that boy's eyes that tells 1,000 stories. And I'm just curious, where is he at? How does he come out of it? Does he repeat the cycle? Does he not? Like, do you guys have a follow-up to this?
Go ahead, Les.
Yeah. Oh, so yeah, we recently went back and saw the family. I said earlier, but you might have missed it. Isaac is out of the military now. He's working in a factory. He thinks and talks about re-enlisting a lot. We will definitely be keeping track of what happens to the family if they remain open and generous enough to continue to tell us what's going on. But I think we're probably done documenting it, is my guess. I think that if somebody else wants to pick up the story, by all means. I'd love to see it in film too. But yeah, I think we're probably done with the documentary for now, forever. Yeah, but it'll be interesting to see, like, another spoiler alert, but Jackson, their little baby son, it's just been so interesting watching him grow up already. He's this little, very rambunctious toddler. If he's not a state wrestling champion, I don't know who will be. He's just like tackling everyone in their yard, and we'll see if if he follows in Brian's path. And I think one thing that's been really interesting for us to see is, as journalists, we really never want to impact the story, and we never want to change things. And yet they've seen this film and it has changed things. And one of the last interviews we did with Brian, he talked about how his kids had experienced trauma, and he acknowledged that, and we had never heard him say that. So to the average person, to hear Brian say his kids experienced trauma, it's like, yeah, whatever. For us, we were like, oh my gosh, Brian just said his kids experienced trauma. And
this was like 2 months ago, like after he'd seen the film.
After he'd seen the film many times. And so even journalistically, it would be the film and the release of the film and the way it's changed their lives has impacted their lives so much that we would almost have to include the documentary and all these phone calls they're getting from people wanting to hear about their story. It would be very meta. So we'll take a step back from that.
That's exactly what I was thinking last while you were talking, and when you asked your question, like it makes journalistically, or just in terms of, I mean, filmmaking and the story that we wanted to tell, they're actually less interesting now. They're, because this film has come out.
They're not less interesting as people, but journalistically.
But they're less interesting as film subjects, because now there's all this stuff happening in their lives that is not an everyday. I mean, we can't tell the story of America through them anymore, right? Because it's changed too much now. So
that's a great. You know what? You guys are so right. You would have to include. It would be hi, we're behind. Like you actually see the curtain. So
yeah.
Great. Well, we're both, me and my husband, we're in the film world, and I'm a former Trojan or alumni, but I can't wait to see what you guys come up with next and whatever you guys create. You guys are, I love the filmmaking. Keep at it, and we'll be supporting you guys the whole time. So thank you guys for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Lauren.
It's so nice of you.
And Lauren's husband.
Drive safe. Drive safe.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
So Rhoda Pell had another question that's kind of in reference to follow up on the family. So I'll invite her to ask that real quick since we're on that topic. Rhoda, you're welcome to turn on video, or if not, you can unmute yourself.
That and that. Oh, I'm here. Hi. I love documentaries. I watched this almost reluctantly, thinking I'm not going to really enjoy this, but I want to know what I'm talking about or seeing at the Zoom. And
you hated it.
Like the previous person, I totally was enthralled with the documentary, and how amazing that all these life things happened to this family. It's like, wow. So my only question, since I have the opportunity, is I don't think it was mentioned whether the accident was a hit and run, and I just was curious. I know it doesn't stick with the storyline, so I understand why it's not addressed in the doc, but I did wonder if they found the driver, if they were prosecuted, and if you did film that, then decided to edit it out. That's it.
Yeah, no,
That's
good question. Yeah, and something that's so important to the family. It was not a hit and run, but it was, I think the family feels very badly about the way that the driver acted. It was a man who was driving, down a country road, and Joey basically crossed. What everyone believes happened is that Joey tried to cross in a place that he shouldn't have, and perhaps it's unclear exactly, like, did he misjudge how fast the driver was going? The driver swerved, but Joey was trying to cross, and so they crashed. It was a very severe impact, and Joey was dragged, and the driver said that his brakes failed and ended up pulling up like further away, but he came back. So it wasn't a hit and run, although he did not immediately stop and help Joey. He said that he kind of, and he had to go get cell service. So he pulled into a driveway because he said that he couldn't get cell service to call 911. So it's all very difficult. There was a woman who drove by and actually thought Joey was a deer. She thought he was a deer, and she pulled over and realized it was a boy and tried to park her car because it was on a hill, and so she wanted to basically stop traffic. and she held his hand until the paramedics came, and she was able to talk to the family about that and being there with him, and really meaningful for everyone.
Yeah, and we did document that, but didn't include it because of what you said. Like, we documented the family meeting the woman who stayed with him. But yeah.
But I do remember that early on, the father did say to Joey, "Be careful in traffic." There was that line.
You remembered it, yeah.
Oh my God! I mean, the picture is perfect. Good luck with your future work. I'm so glad I was able to attend.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your question.
All right, thanks so much for that, Rhoda. We're kind of running out of time, so I'm just going to let this last person ask a question, which is a more general one, but I think it's an important one that we hopefully can kind of speak to a little bit. This is, there we go, Busan. So once again, you're invited to turn on your video if you'd like, or you can just do audio, or do nothing, and I could ask it on your behalf, but that's less fun. So. Busan, can you hear us? You're still muted. Going once, going twice. Unfortunately, it looks like we lost him. It's too bad. The question was about what other kind of work has been done to fight PTSD among veteran soldiers. Thought maybe with your experience with this and your reporting, you have some idea in that field of what kind of work's going on there.
Interestingly, we actually did a Q&A earlier with this organization called Wounded Warriors in Action. So their whole mantra is about getting wounded soldiers. And so PTSD also, it's important to know that very much does not just include wounded soldiers or just soldiers. It could include anyone, of course. Like, you know, some would say the boys had PTSD from their dad being gone, but in this case, since we're talking about soldiers, Wounded Warriors in Action is an organization Brian's a part of, and they really believe in getting soldiers outside to fish and hunt and be like, have camaraderie, which is something that really gets lost after service. Like, you know, these men and women are in these really intense situations, and I tell people that about like school. Like, the reason you bond so much with your classmates is because you go through some trauma together. Like, school's super hard, and and same with journalists. You know, there are certain things in life where you can really bond quickly with someone, and I can't even imagine the bonds that soldiers form. So part of this organization is giving people connections, and another part is getting them outside. I mean, I think there are a number of programs that are geared toward creating some sort of camaraderie, connection to nature, therapy for soldiers, but I don't know if there can ever be, you know, enough. And I would, you know, I would break from that to say I don't know if there's enough, you know, mental health care broadly in the United States of America, but certainly for soldiers and service members that commit to this life that is kind of known for creating post-traumatic stress. So I don't know all the programs, but we know of those couple. Kat, can you think of any more?
There are a lot. I mean, if you're asking about sort of PTSD programs for military, active, or veterans, I think, you know, there are many resources, but I completely agree with Les that there are never enough.
Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I appreciate you both being so generous with time here and talking to us for so long. It's a really wonderful film.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, it's been really great having you. For those watching, be sure to tell people about it. You know, spread the word, and I look forward to seeing more from you guys. This has been great. So
this is lovely.
Take care. Keep in touch.
So much. Yeah.
All right, take care of yourselves.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.